Welcome to Soul of Travel, Women's Wisdom and Mindful Travel. I'm your host, Christine Weinbrenner-Eyrich. Each week, you'll hear me having soulful conversations with women who are tourism professionals, trailblazers, and community leaders around the world. They share their personal and professional journeys to inspire you, and their stories teach you how to become a more conscious traveler, live life aligned with your values, and create a positive impact. We are thought leaders, action takers, and heart-centered change makers, and this is the soul of travel. Beth Kruger is the owner of Women's Room. She curates wellness retreats and experiences for women over 40 that focus on the core pillars of a healthy lifestyle: nutritious food, movement, stress reduction, and relationships. Her transformative experiences support the transitions of midlife by normalizing and celebrating the aspects of living well, of aging with grace and purpose, and of gaining wisdom and confidence in a female body surrounded by a culture that is obsessed with the physical appearance of youth. This is a little bit of a different episode here at the podcast, leaning heavily into the women's wisdom portion of our conversations, and I am so excited to share this with you and to be a catalyst for important conversations for women over 40. Beth and I talk about the confusion many women feel at different stages of their life and the lack of information and community available to them to help them navigate puberty, childbirthing years, and perimenopause. We discuss how we became information seekers during these transitions in our own lives and then wanted to create spaces to share with other women. We talk about midlife, why aging isn't seen as a cool topic, the long-term habits that lead to burnout, and what we can do to avoid it. I ask all of my guests to share 3 words to describe themselves. Beth chose retreat consultant, women's health advocate, and Mayo lover. Join me now for my soulful conversation with Beth Kruger. Welcome to Soul of Travel podcast. I am your host, Christine, and today we are joined by Beth Kruger, and we're going to be kind of continuing this conversation we're having in February on a little bit of inner journey and healing and wellness and well-being and how all of that intersects in travel, as well as a conversation about midlife and like wisdom sharing for women. This theme just emerged, and I'm so excited. That was perfectly aligned to have you, Beth, here for this conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, before we get going, I'm going to first turn it over to you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing that's kind of in the space of travel as it is right now.
Sure. So I am a retreat consultant, and I also facilitate retreats both internationally and domestically here in the U.S., which is where I currently live. I have been brought to this work essentially because I started out in the wellness industry as a yoga teacher with a passion for travel, as well as a passion for women and facilitating conversations with women and connection with women and education for women and advocacy around women's health and women's bodies. So I started adding retreats to the yoga part of my business back in 2017. And so that's kind of how I got into the travel industry. Wasn't really a mistake, but I've definitely started out small and now have grown to just really focus completely on the travel aspect of my business, as well as some of the education piece. But it's all remote now, remote and moving around.
Yeah, I love it. I feel like there is a lot of similar like growth patterns in our like look when I was researching, some of your interests, like I feel like I could see very similar spikes of like what was happening in our life journey that was a catalyst for our own learning and growth and then sharing. And it's like this
Mm,
continuous pattern of like, okay, I'm going through this. I'm going to consume as much information as possible. And now I'm going to create spaces to pass that wisdom along. And it just keeps
yes.
happening on repeat. So I'm really excited to talk with you about this. This is definitely a episode while we're both in the travel space that I think is going to land heavily in the women's wisdom portion of the podcast. And I feel like that's maybe something we're both so passionate about because it's so empowering. And I know for myself, I've really had to look for spaces to find that information.
Mm,
And every time I kind of go through one of these growth cycles in my journey, I'm like, why wasn't there that before? Or was it not? Was it there and I didn't see it because I wasn't in that stage of my own life yet?
mm,
So
mhm,
I feel like maybe we'll uncover some of that as we go along. But for instance, like I noticed that you had started with maybe some like lactation consultant and education for women around childbirth and all of those things. And as I went through that journey, when I had my first daughter, I took oh my gosh, now why can't I remember what it was? But it was a very long series of education around childbirth. And I
mm,
was like, one of the only people I knew of my peers that were focusing that. They're like, "Oh, you mean Lamaze?" I'm like, "No, no, no, no. That's not what I'm learning. I'm like learning
mm,
everything." I'm like,
mhm,
nobody has ever told me any of these things before. Why is that the case? Why is this secret information that I only get
mm,
right now? And then like I kept feeling like women's wisdom was kind of under lock and key like that. And I'm like,
mm,
why is it under lock and key? Is it that like we can't learn it till we're ready? Or is it that there's something about how strong we feel once we have that wisdom that's why it's under lock and key? So this wasn't scripted at all, but let's go ahead
mm.
and like, does that spark anything for you in
Yeah.
relation to your own journey?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, actually. And I completely agree with you that there are these phases in life as a woman that we go through. And there is this huge information gathering or knowledge seeking period that seems to come up. And so, like you said, for me, part of my information seeking journey or part of my career path, I guess, really, started from that information seeking time. I was a yoga teacher in Manhattan, and I started out teaching yoga actually on a whim in a way because I was very stressed out. I was in graduate school and I was pulling all nighters trying to finish projects and make my deadline for my class. And I was not sleeping that much and just full of anxiety. And I found yoga to be this thing that really grounded me and kept me feeling um, whole and peaceful. So I started pursuing this yoga teaching certification and just loving it and soaking up all the knowledge. And after doing that for a few years, I became pregnant. And then I realized, oh, this pregnancy thing, I have no idea what's going on in my body. And like you, I felt like there was so much information that was under lock and key. I didn't grow up talking to my mom about what her birth experience was like or hearing women talk about their bodies or their birth experiences. And so when I was pregnant with my first baby, I realized I really don't know anything. And I think that in about that time of life, and I did a lot of research like you around what was happening to me. And I think a lot of it has to do with that we're not in a communal type of living arrangement anymore. We don't live in a village, a close-knit community where we talk to other women about our cycle or our fertility or our bodies. So we have never really seen women giving birth. We've never probably seen a woman breastfeeding before we've had the opportunity to breastfeed ourselves. So for me, that was like this huge awakening and this huge feeling like I needed to get this wisdom. I needed to learn about this. And the only way I could do it was just like you by consuming a ton of information. And I think a lot of women during the childbearing years are like that, trying to figure it all out because we didn't grow up in that village society where we would have just observed it.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think it's so interesting too when you kind of witness these groups of women seeking the information. And also for me, I've had these moments where when I see the gap and I'm just like, how did I get this far without knowing this about myself? And again, it's kind of this idea of lock and key. And I remember being at a conference and Christiane Northrup was speaking, and
Mm,
she wrote, I'm sure you know the book, The Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom. And,
mhm.
she was just sharing all this information. And I was at a women's conference with like 1,000 women. And she was like, how many people knew this about their bodies? It's like two people. I was like,
Mm,
what? We're all like probably at least women in our 30s and older. Maybe there was a few younger, but honestly, we should have this very basic knowledge. At that point, I had kids, so I'd already gone through some of this cycle, but I just was like, I kept thinking, like, how are we here? And like, then I realized like this gathering of women was rare that I was in.
mhm.
And ironically, when I was there was when I launched Lotus Sojourns. It was an International Women's Day event or
Mm,
conference. And I had decided, okay, that's when I want to launch my business. So
mm,
like I had this idea of like the importance of gathering women and creating community for like sharing knowledge and learning from women all around the world, and hit go. And then I'm sitting in this space where I'm seeing like how important it is that we need these spaces.
mm,
So I love that you also kind of experienced that. And then the other thing, like once I have this knowledge, and I don't know about you, but I'm like, okay, now everyone must know it. Like, I don't want to keep this. I don't want to be the one hiding this information. I'm like, I will talk
mm.
to you about breastfeeding. I will talk to you about childbirth. I will talk to you about all these things. And people are like, oh my God, Christine's coming. It's going to be an awkward conversation. But what, what is that within you? Do you feel the same like passion to get that out there?
Yeah, definitely. And especially now with the work that I'm doing in perimenopause and menopause, because it's about our bodies changing again in another way in entering midlife. And again, well, it's an area people don't want to talk about. And most women don't even want to say the word, certainly not, you know, out in the open, out in the wild there, right? So it's
Mhm.
like kind of almost taboo to talk about the word. And um and certainly, sharing information about it, even though it's really necessary. So I definitely find that is like something I feel really passionately about. It's just like really advocating and educating women about what's going on in their bodies so we don't have to feel afraid of aging. Instead, we can really embrace it powerfully.
Mhm. Do you think, if you're looking at this in the context of travel, when you've traveled, and I'm assuming you'd be like me, that you'll find yourself also connecting with other women where you're
Mhm.
traveling, that this kind of like keeping of information is similar in other countries, or do you think other countries have more open dialogue, or do you think it really varies? Like, what have you witnessed as you see the conversation around women's health and women's knowledge in other places?
I think that's super interesting question. Um, I don't know if you've read a lot about history of childbirth, but when I started going into my deep dive, like you, when I became pregnant and I was learning about birth, Um, Birth actually used to belong to midwives. Like midwives were the ones who helped women through this birthing experience. And when midwives and folks immigrated to the US, hundreds of years ago, from mostly Europe, I guess. We're talking about like maybe the East Coast and the Boston area, right? They a lot of midwives and people moved to the United States of America to come for a different life, a better life, and their older ways, the midwifery type ways of caring for birth, um, they sort of created a smear campaign against midwives. So, being a doctor and being a surgeon was, they wanted to make it like that's where you go to have your baby instead of going to the old granny midwife. So, they kind of created this separation for for the birthing experience for women was like, oh, it's not safe to have a baby with this granny midwife anymore. You need to have a baby in a hospital. It's safer. And it wasn't actually safer, but that's just kind of carried on. So I feel like that's particularly, a colonial thing. And plenty of other countries, Europe, for example, and other countries that were colonized by European countries certainly have a similar kind of gatekeeping of the birthing experience like we have here in the United States. Um, and then, so yes, I do think that there's not that information that's given to most countries that were colonized by European countries. But then those that, I haven't really traveled much in Asia, but I do know that there's very different birthing practices there, different ways of treating aging and the wisdom of that, but it's mostly held by the women and not necessarily kept from them. Um, I also think there's other cultures and countries that I've visited where it's very taboo to talk about the functions of a woman's body anywhere in public. So you might be able to speak with women about their bodies, but it's very uncomfortable for them to talk about, say, menstruation or childbirth or menopause. And they'll talk about it with you in a private space or a place that feels like safe for them to like discuss the experiences that they have in their body. And I think, um, yeah, I think that that's where a lot of our power lies is learning about what's going on in our bodies. So it's
Yeah.
important that we share that information.
Yeah, and as you were talking about that too, I was definitely thinking of uh even when you look at some of the other things that probably come up in working with women and coaching about like trusting our intuition and things like that, that when you take something as natural and kind of primal as birth away from women, that's a huge thing that tells us we can't trust our bodies, like that we
Mm,
have to put our bodies in the power of somebody else. Like we
mhm,
for me, I have three daughters, so my last birth was a home birth. And I mean, and again, obviously, this is something I'm super comfortable talking about at this point, but like that was the strongest, most powerful, most confident I have ever felt in my entire life. And I was like,
mm,
wow, every woman needs to do this.
mm,
And I also understand why this experience has been removed from so many women because
mm,
if we knew how powerful we truly were, I can only imagine how things would be different in our
mm,
society. Like it it was the coolest thing I have ever experienced, and I just think that that's where that disconnect is, where like if we only knew, it changes the game really. And I again, like I got right on to my I'm like I'm going to become a midwife and I'm going to become all these things to share this information because it made me feel so strong. And also I just was so frustrated that like there's only things that you seemed like you could learn once you'd already it was too late to learn it. Like I've already gone through
mm,
this experience, it doesn't serve me to learn about it now. I did
Mm.
remember Bradley childbirth coaching. That's what
Oh,
I
yes.
did.
Mhm.
And I also started, I'm horrible at this. When I love something, I'll like start learning everything about it and think that's my next thing I'm going to teach, which means I've accumulated a lot of knowledge, but I haven't done the thing with a lot of things. But I remember watching my Bradley coach for my second child. I went through it again because it was so powerful, and I was like, oh, I couldn't say these things that she just like sits there and says. I'm like, oh, it would be so terrible to just like say the word, whatever in front of a whole
Mm.
group of strangers, and kind of like you were saying, like in many societies, it's just made so taboo. But I think because if we can feel that afraid of our bodies, like you're you're really in a place where your power is limited. And so when you're looking
Mhm.
at oppression of women, it makes sense to not let them own this knowledge and this experience. And so I
Mhm.
think that's maybe a part of why I feel like it's so important to have these conversations. And then, much like you, now that I am, almost 50 and I'm going through this other midlife transition and I'm like sitting here again, I'm like, oh my God, I forgot we're not talking about the thing until like we're way past the thing. And like
Mhm.
looking at, okay, how do I learn about menopause? My
Mhm.
OBGYN is like, oh no, you're too young. That's not what's happening to you. Like everything, every time I think I know something that's happening in my body, even female doctors were like, you're wrong.
Mhm.
Don't listen to yourself. That's not
Mhm.
right. And then I'm like, I feel like this doesn't feel like the right treatment plan for me. No, that's what works for everybody. And then in fact, it really messed me up. And so I
Mhm.
had to go through this whole process again of like, don't trust yourself. We're going to make sure that this power is in someone else's hands. And then I
Mm.
got all feisty to like talk with women like you about
Yes.
menopause and like owning the conversation. So I would love to step into this. Like, what was your catalyst for gathering and then disseminating this information?
So, like you, I think part of my catalyst was my experience of what was happening in my body. So, maybe around 40 is when I started noticing um, some of the shifts. Things like around 40, I started noticing certain things. And then COVID, actually, when I was home during COVID, during like the early part of 2020, I was really anxious and more anxious. I think everyone was anxious at that time because there was so much unknown happening. Um, and I was like more anxious than, had ever been. And everything felt really uncertain. And I started having all of these symptoms like sleepless nights and insomnia. And I would wake up with night sweats, like drenched in sweat. Like I had to take my clothes off and completely change my pajamas in the middle of the night. And, I was like in my early 40s, so I was like maybe 42, something like that, 43. And I was like, "What is going on? It can't just be the anxiety," even though that was definitely contributing to it. So I started reading more and more about, all the symptoms that I was having. I was kind of looking them up, and then I found the word perimenopause. And it just made total sense to me because I was already really familiar with these hormones because I'd been talking about them all the time in my birthing education classes with my clients. Hormones play a big role in how women feel postpartum. So after they have a baby, they lose all this estrogen that they've built up in their body in the placenta, and when the baby's born, we lose all this estrogen. So we feel really moody and maybe even a little depressed or sad or just low mood. So I already was really familiar with these hormones. So it made just perfect sense to me like, oh, I'm going through perimenopause. Like, that's why I'm sweating like crazy. That's why I'm laying awake at night, like, you know, staring at the ceiling for hours. And also, that's when I started like making some modifications to my lifestyle and my diet and trying out different things to see what could be helpful for me. So that's when I really started like my information gathering. That was the
Yeah.
catalyst for me.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like that is similar for a lot of women when they have that experience, you see them kind of come out to not every woman obviously, or we would be overrun with
Mhm.
coaches about menopause, which is clearly not the case because there's still
Yeah.
so many people who will not even want to say the word. And I think that the other thing that is interesting, and I was just talking about something a little similar last week with a guest, but like that this isn't that we have both the hurdle that aging isn't a cool topic, right? Like
Mm,
we all have seen how women are definitely not supposed to age. That's the narrative that we've been told
mm,
for a very long time. I mean, I still remember like being young and thinking like, when do I have to start using oil of Olay so that I stay young forever? Like I literally remember thinking that, like, what age do you start doing that? Like, wow, that's crazy that that's
mm,
a question. So, it's not cool. We're not supposed to do it. And then it's uncomfortable. And like, I guess what I loved when I kind of heard about the way you were talking about it is like you have really tried to normalize the conversation, make it a little cool. Like I saw you were having perimenopause parties. I'm like, oh my gosh, wouldn't that be amazing? It's kind of like red tent ceremonies or things like
mm.
that. Like
Yes.
if this celebration was such a part of our culture, and I think if we look back, way back historically, this was something that women really celebrated. And I actually had a friend, when she was pregnant with her third child, we had a red tent ceremony. And I mean, it was however modern or whatever it was, but she had this huge red tent inside of her home. All of her women friends gathered, which there were probably 40 of us.
Mm,
And we all sat inside the tent and we all told like birth stories. We all told stories about when we met her. We all told like shared all these things. And as we did, like we lit a candle and we dripped candle wax over
mm,
this giant candle so that she would light that. Her intention was to light that when she was in birth, laboring with her child. And I was like, wow, this is insane. What if everyone did this? How much less
mm.
fear would there be around this? How much more community and celebration? Like you said, like isolation is really kind of what got us away from this sharing.
Mhm.
So, like, I wonder how we make it cool again, or how we make it accessible, or how we help more people feel comfortable with this conversation.
I think it's like bringing it out in the open and doing things like The Red Tent, which, by the way, I love that book. It's like one of my favorite books. I could reread it many times over. Just the idea of gathering together and having that sacred time with women to celebrate being female and everything that it encompasses. I think it's about bringing it out. So with my Perry parties, which is kind of a silly name, and I've definitely heard people have said to me like, "That's I don't like that name," or "Why do you call it that? That's people aren't going to want to come." Well, I haven't really found that is to be the case. I actually find the women that come to the events love being able to be in community with other women and talking about the things that are going on for them. Usually, I start usually we talk somewhat about symptoms because most women don't know what all the symptoms could be for perimenopause. And so um, it's very empowering for them to learn that this mystery thing that's going on for me actually isn't a mystery and doesn't mean that I'm sick or something's wrong with me. It actually is caused by my hormones changing or fluctuating or, lowering, and I can do something about it. So it's sort of, in that way, it's like giving, like you said, giving that woman the power of knowing what's going on in her body, and it just feels like, I think for a lot of women, a relief, and being in community and talking about, some of the silly stuff that comes up for us too is really powerful, and just feels really good to be with other women in that space.
Yeah.
So I think we
And
just
I
have to do more.
yeah, and I think a lot of it too, like, just super basic knowledge that I feel like was reinforced even by Western medicine for me. Like I said, when I was having symptoms and things, and they're like, no, you're too young. And I'm like, okay, well, that jives because I also somehow in my mind only think women in their 60s are actually going through menopause. Why? I don't know, but maybe because, like, when I would watch TV shows when I was younger, women who were 45 or 55 looked like they were 65 or 75. Like, there's that
Mm,
difference, but that's this the narrative that I understood. So when my doctor also said, no, you're too young for this, you have something else wrong with you, then I'm just stuck with, I have something wrong with me.
mm,
And then I finally got into a different conversation with other people, and they were like, no, this does match, let's run your hormones, let's see where you're
mm,
at. And they're like, oh yes, if you look right here, these levels all show that actually yes. And then the other crazy thing was, like, I was like, I haven't had a period for 3 years. I think, like, I'm I've had menopause. Like, I don't even know what to tell you. And they're like, no, that can't be true. There must be something else. And I was like,
mm,
okay, like, I really have to fight for this to be true for me. And it was
mhm,
really, like, kind of going back to what you're saying, like that trust, and that, like, it was really hard for it to feel like a battle. And I just think the more we also understand that, like, there's not one
mm-mm.
way for this
No.
to happen, which we should know because there's no other cycle that happens in women's lives where, like, two friends have the exact same experience. But yet we're still kind of maybe telling women that, like, you'll be this age and you'll have these symptoms, and then
Mm,
it'll be this thing. Um and we're not really, like, showing how varied that experience is and how varied the timeline is based on all these other factors in our lives. So I think that feels really important to me.
mhm. Yeah, and the more we talk about it and the more conversations that we have, the more we'll be able to say to one another, that we actually do know what we're talking about. We can trust ourselves. You can feel confident going into the doctor and saying, "Yeah, I haven't had a period in 3 years." Well, that's technically, I mean, not having a menstrual cycle for 1 year actually means that you've gone through menopause. And menopause, the average age in America is about 52, but you can go through menopause, you can start experiencing symptoms of perimenopause anywhere between 10 years before that menopause year. You don't actually know you're in menopause until you've finished menopause, like
Right.
until you've gone through the year of not having your cycle. And you can go through 6 months, 8 months, 10 months of not having your menstrual cycle and still have another period. And that's still not the full year. It counts, it's supposedly a full year. That's like what it's supposed to be. And
Mm,
we actually don't need to have a blood test to tell us that we're in menopause. We can just trust that based on the symptoms that we're experiencing in our bodies, that's what's going on. I mean, without ruling out any other symptoms. Like if you did have symptoms that were potentially signs of other illness, absolutely you should get checked out for whatever that illness might be. Just check that out. And once you rule out that, then you could attribute those symptoms for sure to the perimenopause menopause journey. And you're
yeah.
right. You're right. Like we don't the idea, at least where we come from, is that we want to look ageless forever and never uh get to look like, the Golden Girls. Like, I don't know if you remember that show, but like they were very much, that was what we thought of was, these were older women, but I don't even know how old they were in that show. They were probably like
Yeah.
50 or
Yeah.
something.
That's funny because that's literally what we were just talking about. Like, as that was my idea of what it must look like to be that age, and how much that shifted, and how much like more youthful and like vivacious and strong women seem now that are actually in that age.
Mm.
And I think they were really like 48 to like
Yeah.
55, which is crazy because, yeah, then you look at Sex and the City now and like compare and contrast like
Oh my
women who are
God.
that age. I don't know if that's better
Totally.
or worse because I'm also still probably not going to be Sarah Jessica Parker, but yeah, it's just like that reframing that what that looks like for women, I think is also really
Mm.
important and really empowering because it allows us um, kind of like when I think when we are our most confident and our strongest and really at the highest potential for us to accept that we are, instead of feeling like we should be on the downhill slope of
Mm.
our lives, we really are just becoming the most comfortable with ourselves. And
Mm.
maybe this journey through menopause is part of that because it's like one of those last times where you are, really gathering wisdom about a major change in your life. Because I think, unless I don't know, oh my gosh, I haven't got there yet. Maybe there's another thing I need to learn about in another 20 years. But, we, we have these major moments, when we're 10, 11, 12, and then, 18, 19, 20. And then whenever you reach childbearing years, if you have children, and then menopause, like there's these huge evolutions as women. And then like I feel like when you finally feel like you have a hold of things is when you're supposed to be like, oh, okay, that's it. But really that to me feels like that's changed, and I love having conversations like this. Hi, it's Christine, hopping in to share about an opportunity that has deeply influenced both my professional and personal journey. Rise Travel Institute's flagship program. I have personally completed this transformative 10-week program, and it remains one of the most valuable educational experiences of my career. Not only did it deepen my understanding of sustainable and ethical travel, but it also helped me to cultivate greater awareness of the impact of travel on communities, ecosystems, and cultures worldwide. The program aligns beautifully with the values of Soul of Travel podcast, focusing on meaningful, responsible, and justice-driven travel. I was so inspired that I became a board member for Rise to help them grow and to share their work with a larger audience. You might consider joining Rise's flagship program if you're looking to gain a holistic understanding of sustainable travel beyond environmental impact, if you'd like to learn how to decolonize travel experiences and make travel more inclusive, you want to explore ethical photography, regenerative tourism, and climate conscious travel, you'd like to connect with global experts and like-minded travelers, or you'd like to earn a professional certificate to enhance your career. Whether you're in the travel industry, a student, an educator, or simply a conscious traveler looking to make a difference, this program will give you the tools to travel with greater intention and impact. The next cohort begins February 25th. It's 100% virtual, self-paced, and includes live discussions, and registration is open now. Completing the Rise Travel Institute's flagship program also makes you eligible for their experiential journey, a very mindfully created travel experience where you can put what you learn to action and gain an even richer understanding of ethical travel. And this year, they are headed to India in November. Right now, there is a discount when you sign up for both the flagship program and the experiential journey. Again, this begins February 24th, so please visit www.risetravelinstitute.org for more details and to register today. Again, I know personally this is a program that can enhance your travel experience no matter what level you're at in your career or whether you're a seasoned traveler or just getting curious about travel. So I hope you'll check out the program. Now let's hop back over to our soulful conversation. the other aspect of your work I love is like looking at your blog and everything is like, okay, here's this for women over 40 and here's this for women over 40. And some people might be like, why do you need to focus on this so much? And yet I feel like it's really important that we do, so that we continue to say like all of this exists beyond this point. Like that's why
Hmm.
it's important to say for women over 40, because for so long we've heard like you're going to hit this point and that's it. And we
Hmm.
need to know that that imaginary line doesn't really exist.
Right. Yes, 100%. We also need to, this time of our lives, this transitional period from maiden, motherhood, right? So we're like maiden, mother, and then we move into this matriarch or crone stage of life, that's like maybe not an attractive word to think about that, but it's this wisdom time where we're moving from caring for everybody else, because if we have children or if we're uh in a relationship, we're probably the major caregiver or a primary caregiver, and there's so much energy constantly being expended if you are a young mother, or for so many years, and then our children eventually leave the nest or kind of move on, or they kind of grow up and become a little bit more self-sufficient. And so that often for many women coincides with the time of this perimenopause menopause journey. And so uh, all of this external energy that's always being spent on other people is now, it would be a great time to turn it inward and be able to use some of that energy for yourself through this transition of life. I know for me, I want to be healthy and vibrant and strong as I'm moving into midlife and beyond. So I want to be able to travel and do all the things that I want to do. That's why I talk about foods to eat over 40, or how we should be exercising over 40, because what you do now in your 40s and 50s is going to set you up for your 60s, 70s, and hopefully 80s, right? If we make it that long, if we are lucky enough to be able to age to be in that phase of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's also interesting too, because there's like that, like you said, this family focus, or even maybe it's career focus or whatever
Mm,
that is. It's this very externally focused period of our life, and then we do tend to have this energetic space that opens up. And I think it's inward, but also community based. Like I think
mm,
very much the work that we're both doing is like really wanting to make sure we're not just supporting ourselves in this phase of like growth and wisdom, but other women. And I think that there's a few spaces where you find that again, like around maybe these major transitions, but
mm.
not just such a collective like wisdom sharing. I just feel like it's such a different energy when you get in a room with a group of women who are 40 or 50 or 60, or like I I remember traveling when I worked for a travel company when I was really young. I was probably in my like early 20s, and most of our guests were probably in there. And again, my age is it's probably skewed. So we're going to call it the Golden Girls effect. But I remember them being like in their 60s and 70s,
Mm.
and the wisdom that they would share with me was so cool that I was like, oh, I can't wait till I like know all of the things and can
Mm.
share it, and I'm not so like self-centered, I guess. And so I
Mhm.
think it's kind of a cool shift, like even sharing in businesses. I feel like when you're young and you're like scrappy and you're entrepreneurial, if that's where you're at, and you're like creating all these things, you don't want anyone else to know what you know. And
Mhm.
then it's like you get to this point and you're like, no, I want everyone else to succeed and thrive as well, so I'm more open to sharing all of this information. And I feel like that is a really cool and fun time to be in as well.
Yeah, like shifting into the mentorship role,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Where you're the one with the wisdom and keeping all of that, but sharing
Yeah.
that.
I mean, I still need lots of wisdom. Let's not pretend
Hmm.
that there's not anything to be gained. I have a lot of more books to read.
Well, I that's one of the things that I think is so amazing about the travel work that it sounds like both of us do really, like bringing all ages together. I'm remembering when you were talking about how you're this young, 20-year-old, and you were doing group trips with women in their 70s, 60s, and 70s or whatnot. It reminded me of this experience where I hosted an event that included like a sauna and cold plunge in the lake, and food and women's circle and all this stuff. And two of the women that ended up joining the group were just about 70. So they were like, one of them was celebrating 70 and the other one was like right behind her. They were like best buddies. And everybody else in the group was like in their 40s and 50s. So it's kind of like there was this age gap between us and these two um, wise elder women that joined our group. And we were talking around the group, like everyone was sort of sharing a little bit about themselves and kind of things were in which they were like a place in which they were struggling or kind of stuck. And w- everyone mentioned different things. So, but definitely the topic of aging was brought up a couple of times, and like what I'm looking, someone was like what I look like or what I feel like, or whatever we worry about, wrinkly skin or gaining weight or whatever this is. And then when one of the older women in our group was her turn to speak, she was just like, this is from my perspective. I look at all of you and think, you're so young and you have so much ahead of you. And she was saying how she feels great and she loves being in the room and loves being with us, and feels like she loves her life. And she is just like, take this moment and like really appreciate how amazing you look and how tight your skin is and all of this stuff, that she was just saying like, this is you're never going to look better than this. This is like the best. And to us, you look amazing and youthful. And so it's all about perspective, right? So,
Mhm.
however we see things, and to hear them sort of sharing that was like really, really great. Just, just a reminder of like, we get so caught up in like where we are, and like our appearance and things like that, that really aren't, they don't mean that much in the grand scheme of our life overall.
Yeah, and of course, unfortunately, that perspective only ever comes like
Yes.
3 steps down the road, and it's
Hmm.
like no matter how much you know that,
Yeah.
and, like, you look back at yourself in your 20s or whatever from now, and you're like, "Oh, if only then," and you're like, "But yes, but I'm that person for this version of me
Hmm.
now. Why can't I harness that in this moment?" I think
Hmm.
that's interesting. And then mentorship, I think, is important in that like intergenerational wisdom, and maybe that's also something lost as we don't really live in community because we don't spend time with our grandmothers as often or our mothers or just within a larger community. And one of the things when I launched Lotus Sojourns, I really wanted to actually do something like a mentor trip where every
Mm.
like 20 to 30-year-old woman that signed up for the trip would be partnered with someone who was like 50 or 60, like, not your parent. So it's a different exchange.
Hmm.
But I felt like I also learned kind of what you were saying, like as I was traveling with people, the way they would see and value something with their reflection and perspective allowed me to see something that I wouldn't get to for a while. And I,
Mm.
for some reason, at least had enough awareness at that point to like grab a hold of that and realize that
Mm.
that was important. And then the other thing, like, I remember like hiking and being somewhere on a really rigorous trail, and I'm like, oh, I hope these people can make it up the mountain. And then not very far, like, I'm the one that's super struggling. And then someone who I expected to needed to help is like scurrying up the side of the mountain. And I also was like, oh, haha, good job. Good job. Way to like project all of these beliefs about someone based on their appearance or their age. And then like also set a mental goal, like, okay, that's what I want my
Mm,
life to look like, when I'm at that point in my journey. So I think those mixed age experiences are really, really valuable for all of those different things.
mhm.
Um, before we get to, well, we're already too far. We're already far in our conversation. Before our conversation ends, I really wanted to talk about too this kind of this idea of like reevaluation in our lives and learning to live with a purpose. And I think when you and I first met, I was again like looking at women in their 40s and 50s from this younger age and thinking, what happens to women that it seems like they all like have this like dump out the apple cart and like
Mm,
jump in like to life in a different way.
mm,
And I was like, what is that? What is that? And now I see maybe it's like the ability to realize where you're out of alignment and also realize like it's now or never. And so people make these big
mm.
changes. Have you witnessed that in
Oh, yeah.
your coaching and teaching?
Yes. Mhm. Yeah. This time of life, 45 to whatever, 55, something like that, is a time of tremendous change and transition for most, I would say, people, because I think there's a lot of change and transition for men too.
Hmm.
But speaking from a women's perspective, there's this huge shift and change in our physical body, in our hormonal um, experience, and that affects all these different areas of our body, every system of our body. And also, I don't know about, I can't speak for everybody, but I have talked to a lot of women that I know. It's just sort of like there's just this um, phrase that a lot of people use. They just don't care that much about what other people think, caring less and less about what other people think or what's expected of them, either societally or at work or in their home. It becomes more about, I've been um, doing things for everyone else or acting a certain way or behaving a certain way, and now I'm ready to do, I want to worry about me now. So I think there's a huge change for a lot of women in this age range, and you see it all over the place, huge amounts of transition.
Yeah, and I also imagine that's why that's one of the largest population of travelers is women
Yes.
over 50, like, and solo travelers. Like, it's
Mm,
like, okay, now it's for me, and I'm ready for this growth experience, and I'm ready
mm-hmm.
to give something back to myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's time to do all the things that I said I wanted to do when I was younger, or I kept putting off because of whatever other reason. Um, I think you face this time in your life, you're like, oh my God, it's now or never. I'm either going to do that thing or it's never going to happen for me. So
Hmm.
you see huge amounts of change. It's traveling on the trip, it's getting that divorce, it's changing careers or quitting that job that you've had forever.
Hmm.
So much transition.
Yeah, it makes me just like imagine like all the fierce warriorness of women just like, okay, enough with that, like slash that, slash that, slash that. And I would see it and I think I was just envious. I'm like, I kind of want
Mm,
to be able to wield that sword in my life now and not
mm,
have to wait till I have this magic like sense of freedom or this magic disconnect from societal expectations. Like I was like, I can't wait till I feel whatever that is lift off so that I can just start like getting to where I want to actually be. And
mm,
I think also I find myself trying to give permission to people to do that sooner. Like you don't have to carry that now. I think that's also part of why so many conversations I have on the podcast, I really try to highlight those moments in women's lives when they're like, nope, now I'm doing this thing.
Mm.
because it's just so possible to not carry those expectations for so long. Like there's nothing that says you have to wait till you're 45 to live your life aligned with who you are. Like you really could
Mhm.
start that at 20 if you have the perspective or you have the comfort with like upsetting the norms and the shoulds and all of that thing. And I have
Mhm.
also, because I spend a lot of time in like gathering knowledge in coaching classes. I just did a year-long Ayurveda course, and there were some women in there that were like in their 20, like late 20s or maybe even mid 20s and early 30s. And I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot imagine having this knowledge and also this peer group at that age. That's really powerful and so cool.
Mm. Definitely. Yeah.
Um,
Bravery.
uh, yeah,
Yeah,
yes,
you
that's
talked
something
about
we need.
bravery. Mhm.
One of the last things I had for us to talk about is burnout. And you had
Mm.
just talked a little bit about how, you know, the things you do today impact later, us are in our lives later. And when you and I were preparing for this conversation, you know, we were talking a little bit about burnout and how so many people think that's something that just like sneaks up on them and it's something that just happens all of a sudden. And you know, I think for many people, but many women, burnout is a part of our journey at some point,
Mm.
but it's not something that happens like overnight. Can we
Mm-mm.
chat a little bit about maybe that mindset around burnout?
Yeah. I think when we were talking about burnout the other day, we were talking a little bit about just, there's been books written about burnout. A lot of people have experienced burnout. It's what what seems to be the where we how we get to it is actually a slow accumulation of little things over time that we either ignore or don't do that lead to this sort of event, crisis, breakdown, burnout experience, right? Because now we have a name to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a constant ignoring of our basic needs, for lack of like a better description. And I think that, some people have done a really great job of distilling down what those things that we could do to avoid burnout might be. Should we talk about those?
Sure, that would be great.
Yeah. So I was I was mentioning with you the other day about this this book that Emily Nagoski and Amelia Nagoski wrote. They're two authors, sisters, that co-wrote this book called Burnout, and they talk about how burnout essentially became this hugely popular topic from that they took from one of their other books, a previous book, and they decided, oh, we have to write that that previous book just had a chapter about burnout and how it affected every the topic of that book, and they were like, oh, we really need to write an entire book on burnout because everybody is talking about this with us and obviously it needs more attention. So women all over were talking to them about how they had been experiencing burnout and what could they do about it. And essentially, these two authors wrote that we we need to manage uh, these elements that would potentially cause us to burn out, like um, eating properly. So, like, kind of paying attention to like our nutrition and the food that we're taking into our body. Um, Exercise was one. So it's like everything every health coach probably talks about already. But these are basic elements, right? Our exercise, our sleeping, and kind of the amount of sleep we're getting or the quality of sleep that we're getting. Um, and then and all of many of these things are like our stress disbursement, because we're all going to experience stress. We can't reduce stress. We could manage it a little bit or disperse it from our body by practicing some sort of stress management techniques. And many people use things like exercise to help move some of the accumulated stress out of the body. But there's also other things that we can do, like meditation or breathing practices that might be helpful, and then like some other things like having hobbies and spending time with friends and talking to, um, really prioritizing some of those things in our life that we might not be prioritizing,
Hmm.
right? If we're just working constantly and always like doing focusing on our career, or if we're taking care of children and an aging parent, we could experience burnout. It doesn't always have to be about like your career and what you're doing in your career. It could be you're experiencing burnout because you're being pulled in so many different directions, taking care of everybody else's needs instead of pouring something into your tank so you're not empty.
Hmm. I think it's interesting too because I think for a while, kind of like people will say busyness is a badge of honor, right? To say like, oh,
Mm,
I'm so busy, that like proves that I have
mm,
value and worth. And
yeah.
almost the same with like, oh yeah, burnout. Like I totally have burnout or I'm burnt out. Like
Yeah. I'm
as
so
if
burnt
it,
out.
like if it's something cool to achieve, which I'm like, oh, that's a whole nother can of worms to like understand culturally why we feel
Mm,
that that's an important way to show up.
mm-hmm,
But as you were talking about stress, and I know, for many things, menopause included, like that's one of the things that like you have to reduce stress. And you're like, oh,
mm-hmm,
great. Well, I can't reduce stress because I'm having hot flashes and I can't sleep at night or whatever. I'm stressed about
mm,
that. But the
mm-hmm,
skill set of learning how to disperse, I love how you said that, to disperse that from your body is something that I think, especially, and I can only speak from my existence in the US, but like I feel like that's something that we don't learn. It's not culturally like meditation or yoga or
mm,
mindfulness wasn't something that I was taught. Thankfully, I feel like my kids are having a lot of more conversation in their childhood about it than I ever was. But like the idea that we can control how it lives in our body is what we
mm-hmm,
can do. And I think that's a really, really valuable perspective shift because then that does give us a little control. Like all these things are going to be happening around us, but we can help to make sure it doesn't become a part of our DNA, I guess, so to
mm-hmm.
speak.
Yeah. And so, how do we make sure that the building blocks are in place so that we are able to feel really good and be more resilient so that we can face all of the challenges that continue to come up in our lives? No matter what we're doing, we're going to have external things that will stress our stress our lives, stress our bodies. And so we have to use those building blocks, which is that, the nutrition piece, the movement of the body piece, the sleeping piece, so basic, right? And then,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, the stress reduction or management through some sort of mindfulness and community,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and connecting with other people, which is like what we're doing here.
Yeah. So good and so important. And it's funny that Um, as you're talking, I just reminded myself of last night when I was going to sleep. And I was like, oh, I've really taught myself how to go to sleep better now.
Mm,
And I was really proud of the awareness of like how to get my body to release and calm down because it had been a
mm,
real struggle for a long time.
hmm. I mean, I think in a lot of us, um, well, since smartphones came to be like a thing, right? Because they haven't really been in our lives for all that long. I mean, I think, what, 2010 or 2011, something like that. So maybe it's just a little bit over a decade and a half now that we've had smartphones. Um, we have become so connected to a device and to, things like that, that our sleep hygiene is bad because we sit on our on our device in bed, or we're reading this, and or we're like tuning out, watching television at night and not and also we're bombarded constantly with information like news can be very triggering, can be very stressful for a lot of people. So just the access constantly to information is is a lot. So we have to really like clean up the sleep by shutting some of those things down early, like getting into a zone. I don't know if you dim the lights or if you have like a ritual of like tea or, um, you know, having a bath or a shower or something like that that's like signaling to your body. But those are all really great ways to move towards a good night's sleep.
Yeah. And I know that we only have a few more minutes before we need to
Mm-hmm.
do our rapid fires, but the one thing that I had mentioned the Ayurveda study, and I know that's something that you have also focused on. And one of the things I thought was so helpful is learning like about digestion, and that that's not just food, but like everything that comes into your body has to digest and process. And so that's,
Mm,
sights and sounds and smells and social media.
mm,
Like once I had that awareness, I really realized how much those things bog us down. And I wish I could remember the statistic, but it was something about like in our childhood, how many like points of stimulation per minute was like 10 or something, and today's
mm-hmm,
children it's like 1,000, and that
mm,
our bodies haven't evolved to be able to process that much, to digest that much. And that's why there's all these different things that are happening to us physiologically. And so
mm-hmm,
I'm sure now I'm going to have to go find the statistics so that I can
mm-hmm.
share it accurately in the future, but I think
Right.
it's a really powerful awareness.
Yeah, it's about our balance in our doshic body, right? So we're all made up of a um, certain elements, depending for in terms of the Ayurvedic um, philosophy, right? So we all have a certain mix of the three doshas, right? Pitta, Kapha, and Vata. And my teachers talk about how our society today is filled with a lot of Vata energy,
Mhm.
wind, space, you know, that's like all around us. So yeah, that's like we kind of everyone has this Vata imbalance now.
Mhm.
Um, so it's trying to ground that um, that windy space element and balance it for everyone. So yeah, very
I
important
love
for us
that.
to
I don't
do.
know why that didn't dawn on me, but as soon as you started saying it, I was like, oh yeah, our whole world is Vata right now. No
Hmm.
wonder that's so I have migraines that my teacher was like, oh, you have just incredibly well, they're tridoshic, but she's like, you have super Vata
Mm.
migraines. And I was like, oh yeah, I mean, all of this stuff lands there. Okay,
Hmm.
that's part two because now we've
Yes,
just lost people.
another
They're like, wait, what's
conversation.
happening?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I loved this conversation so much. I really appreciate that you were able to like jump into all this stuff. I know it's what you love talking about too, but I appreciate someone able to kind of go there with me. I don't get to talk about this a lot, and it makes me happy to at least create a space where people can begin to feel comfortable with these conversations and these topics. If people would love to reach out to you to work with you or to travel with you, what would be the best way for them to go about that?
Probably connecting through my website at bethkruger.com. It's Kruger. Beth Kruger
Perfect.
is the best way.
Great. Well, let's do our rapid fire ish questions to wrap
Sure,
us
I'm
up.
ready. Thank you.
Okay. What are you reading right now?
I'm reading a book about, it's a historical fiction about Agatha Christie's mysterious 10-day disappearance. So I'm really enjoying it. It's a novel. I
Great.
forget the name.
That's okay. I'm sure there's Google, right?
Yeah.
In our Vata world, there's Google.
Yeah.
What is always in your suitcase or backpack when you travel?
Um, Earplugs for sure, because I can't sleep without them in a strange place. And I love something that smells like lavender. That's always a good one for me.
Mhm. To sojourn to me means to travel somewhere as if you live there. Where is some place you would still love to sojourn?
Mm, so many places. But Italy is on my list right now. I've been there, but many times, but I've always feel like going back there. It's like
Yeah.
home to me.
Mhm. What do you eat that immediately connects you to a place you've been?
Mm. Um, well, anything in a tagine or anything flavored with harissa immediately transports me to Morocco. So anytime I taste those spices, right
Mhm.
back.
Who was a person that inspired or encouraged you to set out to travel the world?
My one of my first yoga teachers actually. Her name's Rachel. She and I went on a trip many, many years ago, and that inspired me to do my first retreat.
If you could take an adventure with one person, fictional or real, alive or past, who would it be?
I wonder, oh my gosh, good one. My daughters, can I say two people? They're my
Hmm.
favorite travel companions. I love going new places with them.
Yeah. I didn't realize that you had daughters as well. I love that so many women I know that are like really uh, like focused on healing women and creating spaces for women have like their own little women.
Mm,
So,
yes.
um, who is one woman in the travel industry you admire and would love to recognize here in this space for celebrating women in the industry?
Well, again, two women. I knew that you were going to say this, but I couldn't just do one. But I really actually want to recognize the two women that created the group that connected us, Janine Cohen and Catherine Gallagher, who created Women Travel Leaders. I just love the community that they've created for women in travel, and I think that they're really inspiring, and I love that they've created a space for women all over the world to connect doing things that they love, to travel. And I love supporting other women-owned businesses. So to me, it's a great community, and I really appreciate that they've created it.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm always happy to celebrate them as well. They're an ally of the podcast and we have a lot of overlap in the work that we're doing. And yeah, it's a really special community that I'm also very grateful for. And I'm glad for the connection. So
Yes.
it's really great. Thank you so much again for being here and for sharing this conversation and maybe another conversation more around wellness and travel will be on the books, but this is what I was really excited to dive in with you because this is a unique space that you hold for conversation. So I appreciate you sharing today.
Yes. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Soul of Travel, presented by Journey Woman. I hope you enjoyed the journey. If you loved this conversation, I encourage you to subscribe and rate the podcast. Please share episodes that inspire you with others because this is how we extend the impact of this show. Learn more about each of my guests by reading our episode blogs, which are more than your average show notes. I think you'll love the connection. Find our episode blogs at www.souloftravelpodcast.com. I am so proud of the way these conversations are bringing together people from around the world. If this sounds like your community, welcome. I am so happy you are here. I am all about community and would love to connect. You can find me on Facebook at Soul of Travel Podcast or follow me on Instagram either at she.sojourns or at Soul of Travel Podcast. Stay up to date by joining the Soul of Travel Podcast mailing list. You'll also want to explore the Journey Woman community and its resources for women travelers over 50. I'd also like to share a quick thank you to my podcast producer and content magician, Carly Eduardo, CEO of Convergente. I look forward to getting to know you and hopefully hear your story.